I'm Beth Ann Miller. I'm the pastor at First Presbyterian Church, which meets upstairs, over there. UCC Zion Church has graciously let us rent space here, and we've enjoyed our home very much. First of all, the Reverend Ike Perkins has a presentation he wants to make to our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Brian Blount. After he has done that, I will further introduce Dr. Blount. So, Reverend Perkins.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
As she said, my name is Ike Perkins, and I am the pastor of Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church, just right across the hill from here. Also, I serve on the city council here in Lenoir. And I would just like to take this opportunity to welcome Pastor Blount to the greatest city in North Carolina, and not to let you get out without recognizing you and giving you a token of our appreciation here in Lenoir. Unfortunately, I have another engagement, and I may have to leave early, so if you see me tipping out, it's not disrespectful, it's just that I have another engagement. So at this time, sir, I would just like to present this to you.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of our great mayor, Mayor Joe Gibbons, and the city of Lenoir and the city council, we'd just like to say welcome to Lenoir and hope that you enjoy your stay and return soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It really is a pleasure for me to be able to welcome and introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Brian Blount. Oh yes, please, cell phones off, not just down, but off, because it interferes with we are taping this, so if you will turn those off. Dr. Blount is a graduate of the College of William and Mary, Princeton Theological Seminary, where he got his Master's of Divinity, and Emory University, where he earned his PhD. He served as a pastor for a while, and then he was at Princeton Theological Seminary as a professor in New Testament. And by God's good grace, he was called to be the president of Union Presbyterian Seminary in 2007. And that's very dear to my heart. That's where I graduated, before 2007, but anyway, we'll talk about that. He has just been phenomenal there, as it's done many wonderful things since he has been there. The seminary has really flourished, and even if you're not Presbyterian, I encourage you to go visit it sometime. If you're in Richmond, Virginia, it's a place that's very dear to my heart. I wish I could go back and do it over again. It has always been a place where biblical studies have been of foremost importance, and it continues to be that. Dr. Blount is primary work has been in the Gospel of Mark and the book of Revelation. Our church studied your 12, is it 12? I can't remember now, 12 CD series, yes, a while back, and that is where we originally said, hey, we would like to have you come and speak, and so we eventually got around to having that work out and having you come. We'd like to have you come back and talk about Revelation, since you're not talking about that today, but we really did appreciate that very, very much. He has written 6 books and has been the co-author of several others. I have his Revelation commentary, which if you are a pastor, I recommend very, very highly. It is an outstanding commentary, and it was received an award for, I will get that wrong probably, but he did the 2009 top reference work by the Academy of Parish Clergy. So it is an excellent work. And he has also been a Beecher Lecturer, 2011 at Yale Divinity School at Yale. And he has a wife, Sharon, and 2 children, Joshua and Kaylin. And I think that what I can say that is most important about Dr. Blount, having heard him speak, been around him, and also heard him preach, and he is an outstanding preacher, and I welcome any of you to come to worship tomorrow up there and join us while he is preaching. He is a man of great integrity. He is a man of God. He is a fine, fine Christian person, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today, bro.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you, all of you, for being here. And I look forward to having a chance to talk with you a little bit about race and the church. I'm going to be talking from my perspective, my church, as a matter of fact, the Reformed Presbyterian tradition, but I think what you'll be hearing carries across all different Protestant traditions. So we're really talking about Protestant Christianity and race and slavery. And I'm going to look at it from a historical point of view in my presentation, and then we'll look forward to some questions from you and conversation as we talk about it in a more contemporary context as well. But first, let me say how delighted I am to be here with you and to see all of you here to come and talk about this important topic. As Beth said, I enjoy talking about the book of Revelation, as you might imagine. So I'm happy to come back at some point and do that with you as well, especially those of you who work through that series. I love to hear how people have responded to it, and I have opportunity to do that. I also want to bring you greetings from Union Presbyterian Seminary. As you heard, we have our main campus in Richmond. That's where we have students do residential theological education. We also have a Charlotte campus where we have students go on the weekend. So students will be driving as far away as 200 miles to come on Saturday to do their studies. That means that it takes them a little bit longer to do a Master of Divinity there than it does in Richmond, 3 years in Richmond and 5 years in Charlotte. But wherever they are, whichever campus, people feel deeply called to what they're doing. So if you are, as Beth said, if you happen to be in Richmond, we're on the north side of Richmond. I would invite you to come by and stop and visit with us. I tell that to congregations when I'm preaching all over the country. And I also say that you don't have to say anything ahead of time. Just stop by, come to my office, and I'd love to give you a chance to see our campus. And I also say that every once in a while it does happen. I'll be in my study, I'll be working away at something, my assistant will come in knocking on the door and she'll say, such and such is here from such and such a church, and they said that you said that when they were in Richmond they should come by and visit the seminary. And I always enjoy when that happens. So if you find yourself in Richmond, please do look me up. We are, as I say, are going to be talking about, as you know, Protestantism, and I'm going to look specifically at the Protestant church that I am a part of, the Presbyterian church, the Reformed faith, slavery, and race. We'll talk about that today. I want to start with an article quote called Redemptive Ethics, More Than Forgiveness of Sin. It was written by Katie Geneva Cannon, one of my dear friends, a professor at Union Presbyterian Seminary. She died last year, much too early, has been a tremendous scholar across the world in doing ethics and particularly womanist theology. And she has several articles where she's looked at faith, race, and slavery. So let me start with one of hers, Redemptive Ethics, More Than Forgiveness of Sin. Katie makes the following intriguing statement. The transatlantic trade of Africans, founded on Christianity, is a pretext informing the worldview into which John Calvin was born 500 years ago, 10 July 1509. That statement is intriguing for two reasons. One, the claim that the slave trade was founded on Christianity. Two, that this Christian-based slave trade informed the worldview into which Reformed Christianity was birthed. Striking statement. We take our students at Union Seminary on a travel seminar in West Africa to Ghana. One of the things that they see in Ghana is the Elmina slave castle. One of the places that's of note in the Elmina slave castle is this place called the Door of No Return. And at the Door of No Return, you can see the small opening that looks out into the harbor, and this is the last place that slaves were in an edifice on the African continent before they were put on the slave ships and moved to the New World, quote-unquote New World. What is significant about it is that it is a Dutch Reformed sanctuary in the castle, and below the sanctuary, you would be sitting in the sanctuary, below the sanctuary is a holding area for female slaves, or females who are going to be enslaved. The male area was is at a different part, or was at a different part of the castle, but the females were underneath the worship space in the sanctuary, so as this Christian congregation was at worship, slaves were beneath their feet. This is what Katie Cannon is pointing to in that quote. This is part of what she's pointing to. Now, upon what data does she rely in order to make such a thought-provoking statement? The first thing we want to do is look at the dates. Are the slave trade and the Reformation time-related at all? The Reformation that leads us, the Protestant Church. Perhaps the anchor date should be 1517, the year that generally marks the initiation of Martin Luther's overall Reformation. Was the slave trade already operating at the start of the Reformation? In other words, did the slave trade, as Dr. Cannon argues, provide the historical context into which the Reformation and the Protestant Church began? The answer, I think, is yes. While some make the case that the slave trade began as early as 1409, others make the case that the modern European slave trade began in Africa in 1441, when 12 men were captured in Africa and taken to Portugal. 1441. In Portugal, slave labor on sugar plantations existed as early as 1452. Was there an early Christian connection to the trade? Cannon argues that religion was instrumental in motivating Prince Henry of Portugal, later called the Navigator, to put into motion Europe's aggressive and ruthless expeditions into Africa. Henry was the administrator of the Order of Christ, the Portuguese successor to the Knights Templar, the military order formed in the aftermath of the First Crusade in 1095. These soldiers existed to safeguard Europeans who made pilgrimages to Jerusalem and also travel to West Africa. Katie Cannon notes, Henry trained men to sail from Portugal down the west coast of Africa in search of the limits to the Muslim world in order to halt the Islamization of West Africa and to accelerate the spread of Christianity. So he's about halting two things: Islam from moving too much and Christianity to move further. The Catholic Pope of the time issued papal bulls giving rights of patronage to Henry, which authorized him to appoint clerical orders to evangelize and to become the primary European Christian agent in this African evangelical endeavor. So we're talking about the Catholic Church, the broad church, before the Reformation takes place at this point. According to Peter E. Russell, Henry the Navigator considered conversion and enslavement as interchangeable terms. That's pretty powerful. Conversion to Christianity and enslavement as interchangeable terms, experiencing no cognitive dissonance in using Christianity as a civilizing agent for making converts into slaves. Convert, enslave, as a part of the evangelical missionary movement of the Navigator, endorsed by the church. A bit of broader context in the form of some dates, so. 1441, the European slave trade begins. 1517, the Reformation initiates. 1483 through 1546, we have the life of Martin Luther. 1509 to 1564, the life of John Calvin, very important in the Presbyterian tradition. 1619, the red letter date at Jamestown Colony when the first African slaves as indentured servants arrived in the New World. 1640, the first U.S. Presbyterian Church. This church established in a context where slavery was already well established in the colonies. And then 1789, the first General Assembly of the American Presbyterian Church. All of these dates, all of these events happening within that broader date of the beginning of the slave trade and the continuation of that trade. In other words, I'm agreeing by putting these dates together with Katie Cannon that the slave trade is a huge part of the context into which the Protestant church as a whole and the Presbyterian church in particular began. Not just in Europe, but in the New World of the American colonies as well. So we've looked at the Catholic Church through the work of Henry the Navigator in Portugal, and now we're moving more specifically into the Protestant church where most of us fit. The question remains, though, can one argue a connecting point between Christianity and slavery? I think I already have with Henry the Navigator. But even so, did the Protestant church already reforming come to speak and act in a transformational way about slavery? Did the church finally see that slavery was not of God and then promote that to its congregations? And when did it do so? We know that it ultimately did so, but when did it do so? Let's take the question in turn. The first question, the connection between slavery and Christianity. It is even earlier than the Portuguese establishment of the European slave trade, this connection between Christianity and slavery. In America, before the Civil War, the majority of evangelical Christians were convinced that their personal relationship with Christ authorized them to own slaves. They come to such beliefs with a historical backing, at least in their understanding. Leading figures in the Catholic Church from St. Augustine forward considered slavery acceptable and God-sanctioned. After the Reformation, the tradition carried over to many Protestant sects. Indeed, many Christians came to their conclusions based on their literal reading of the Bible. And you've heard the understanding, just read the plain text of the Bible. Well, it was from the reading of the plain text that these evangelical Christians came to the understanding that there was a connection, or there was an endorsement of the Christian faith and slavery. Let's look at some of those texts. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 45. As for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing with you and from their families that are with you who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. Leviticus.
Well,
Yes. So read the plain text, which is what the early Christians were doing, and some later Christians as well. Genesis 9:25 through 27. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of all slaves shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." Now you'll notice there's nothing about race in this material, right? This is about domination and conquest. You conquer a people, you may enslave the people. What we do have in this interpretation, however, of that account about Canaan is a race-based interpretation that comes out of the Christian church later in the United States, where there's an identification of Ham, Canaan's son, being the one who is dark of skin, and therefore, because he does something inappropriate, sees Noah naked, that he can therefore be accursed and be enslaved. But what you notice from the text is that Ham actually was not the person who was talked about, it was Canaan. However, there is this racial interpretation that it's Ham, and then Ham represents the African people, and because Ham could be enslaved, then all of the African peoples would follow that fate. So what you see is in this non-racial to racial interpretation of the text that's happening in a Christian context. But again, we're reading from the plain text, Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 through 21. When a slave owner strikes a male or a female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. Exodus. The New Testament has some equally interesting language. Matthew chapter 24, verses 45 through 46. Who then is the faithful and wise slave whom his master has put in charge of his household to give the other slaves their allowance of food at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom the master will find at work when he arrives. 1 Timothy 6:1 and following. Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and teaching may not be blasphemed. All under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor. Ephesians 6:5 through 6. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling and singleness of heart as you obey Christ. 1 Peter 2:18 and following. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. Which I read to be a pretty harsh statement. As a matter of fact, one of the things I found interesting when I was looking at slave narratives from African-American slaves in the American South, there's a great deal of material that one can find, interviews of slaves after slavery, also writings from slaves. There is this wonderful, well, it's maybe not a wonderful story, but it's an eye-opening story, I guess I should put it that way, where there was a congregation of slaves. They were being preached to by a white evangelist, a white minister, because the slave owner would not allow a black preacher to preach to his slaves for fear that the preacher might be preaching something other than be submissive and accept your lot in life. And in this case, while the preacher was preaching, he chose from his text, a very interesting text, the one of Philemon. You know what happens in Philemon, right? The slave runs away, and what happens? Goes to Paul, and what does Paul do? Returns him to his owner. And the account goes that half of the slaves got up and walked out of the church at that point, and the other half only stayed so they could argue with the preacher that no such text existed in the Bible. Because for them, there was a discrepancy between their understanding of what God was doing in the world and this reading of this particular text. A challenge brought to the text by these slaves. A very interesting kind of interpretation already beginning by these slaves. Another example that I like to use is, anyone know the name Howard Thurman? Howard Thurman was an African-American spiritualist. He was the dean of the chapel at Howard University, wrote some wonderful books on the history of African-Americans, particularly out of slave tradition. He talks about the fact that his grandmother had been a slave. And and she couldn't read or write because she wasn't allowed as a slave child to learn to read and write. So he was tasked, because he was going into the ministry, with reading the Bible to his grandmother. But there was one part of the text that his grandmother would not allow him to read, and he asked her at one point, "Why won't you ever let me read to you from the letters of Paul?" And she said, "Old man McGee, the owner, was so mean that he would never let a Negro preacher preach to his slaves, and whenever the white preacher preached to the slaves, they would preach, 'Slaves, be obedient unto your master as unto Christ.' She promised herself that if freedom ever came, she would never read that part of the Bible." So there's this internal discussion going on with the slaves and these biblical texts, and these slaves are recognizing something that other interpreters, at least white interpreters of the text, did not recognize, and that is that there is something about what God is doing in the world that goes beyond what is literally written on the page in the text, that one had to read beyond what was just the plain word on the text to really understand what God was doing in the world. We'll talk about that at the end of this as we have some time for discussion. But in any case, I've just given you a sampling of these texts that became justification for many Christians who believe that God not only allows slavery, but indeed sanctions slavery. And we're seeing, again, as I say, African-American slaves beginning to challenge that in their interpretations. After all, does not the Reformed principle of sola scriptura, those of us who are Presbyterian, we know this understanding of only Scripture expects us to give authority to the text. The primary place for Reformed Christianity is with the text. You know, the understanding being that there was in the Catholic Church an equalization between the text and the tradition, the history of the church, and oftentimes there was the history of the church as interpreted by the Pope that would get people to do things that might be contrary to what the text was suggesting. Well, in the Protestant Reformed tradition, the authority went to the text as opposed to the church tradition. Does not the Reformed principle therefore give authority to the text? And if the text says that slavery is okay, how can we then argue against slavery? So we come to the 1856 testimony of the Reverend Thomas Stringfellow, a Baptist minister from Culpeper, Virginia, who writes, "A brief examination of Scripture testimony on the institution of slavery." That's the title of his book. Listen to three of his strong statements. First, quote, "The right of holding slaves is clearly established by the Holy Scriptures, both by precept and example," unquote. Second, Jesus Christ recognized this, slavery, as an institution that was lawful among men, unquote. And third, had the holding of slaves been a moral evil, it cannot be supposed that the inspired apostles who feared not the faces of men and were ready to lay down their lives in the cause of God would have tolerated it for a moment in the Christian church, unquote. To get an even broader sense of the connections between Protestants and slavery, it would help to go back and scan the history of the slave trade itself. In his book, Protestants, the Faith That Made the Modern World, Alec Ryrie entitles a key chapter in his book, Slaves to Christ. In it, he begins in 1596, when a Dutchman captured a Portuguese ship in order to sell its cargo of 130 African men and women. He brought them into the port of Middelburg in the Netherlands. The folks of Middelburg saw the Africans as human beings and not cargo, and therefore ruled through their legal authorities that these Africans should be set free. The next year, Middelburg adopted a policy that spread across the Netherlands that any enslaved person who stepped onto Dutch soil was, at that very moment, freed. So here we have the Christian church making an alternative interpretation. And yet there were tensions within the Netherlands about slavery. Despite Middelburg, from the 1630s on, Ryrie notes that Dutch traders delivered some 460,000 enslaved Africans to the New World. 100,000 died on Dutch ships. There is no way to know how many were killed in Africa resisting capture. The numbers are even more staggering when one considers, as Ryrie warns, that the Dutch were not even the big players in the slave trade. European slave traders shipped approximately 12 million people across the Atlantic. A staggering 10 to 15% of those captured died en route. The largest of the slave trading countries was Great Britain. Now, I'm using the conservative estimate that historians use. Some historians argue that it's much more than 12 million, but the conservative effort number is there. So I'm using the floor rather than the ceiling or the middle of the number. Ryrie goes on to talk about the slave trade, and he opens a section entitled The Emergence of Protestant Slavery with this very powerful statement, quote, "By any means, Atlantic slavery was one of humanity's greatest crimes. It was also intimately connected with Protestantism," unquote, which means all of us, because we're all Protestants. He goes on to note that while many, I think we are there any, let me not make that assumption. Do we have Catholic brothers and sisters here with us in the congregation? And it's well, okay, all right. I'm not going to take that bait. We do have one Catholic brother in the...
No, I'm not a Catholic, but I do visit the Catholic.
Okay, well, good. And that's why I wanted to include at the beginning Henry the Navigator and his connections with the Pope. But I'm focusing because I'm thinking most of us are Protestants here. It was also Atlantic slavery intimately connected with Protestantism. He goes on to note that while many Protestants, like those at Middelburg in the Netherlands, concluded from the beginning that slavery was wrong, many Protestants not only accepted and collaborated with slavery, some even developed a biblical defense of it as a Christian ideal. Ryrie points out helpfully that Atlantic slavery was very different from the ancient forms of slavery as mentioned in the biblical materials. I do want to make that point. In the ancient world, slavery, as I've already intimated, was based on conquest for the most part. One country conquering another country took the folks in the other population as enslaved persons as spoils of war. In the ancient world, slavery was compared to poverty, an inescapable fact of life. You're going to have people who are poor, you're also going to have people who are enslaved. Quote, "Christianity was formed in the Roman Empire, one of the most slave-based societies ever seen," unquote. That's Ryrie again. How did the early Christians respond to this slave-based society of Rome? Spiritually, non-confrontationally. Ryrie says, quote, "They insisted on spiritual equality of all believers," unquote. I do want to make the point that we're talking about Galatians 3:28, and everybody knows that text who's a Christian, right? In Christ there is no ultimately slave nor free. The question is Paul speaking physically or is he speaking spiritually? Now, if he's speaking physically, there's no male nor female, there's no slave nor free. It suggests that we can't have people enslaved to other people. But if he's speaking spiritually, then we can get around, we can fudge that understanding. So the question becomes, how do we interpret the biblical text, spiritually or physically? Many understood Paul to be making a spiritual argument, and so physical slavery was of little consequence, and Christian slaves ought to humbly submit to their masters in that interpretation. Paul, you will remember, as I said a little earlier, sent runaway slave Onesimus back to his master Philemon, asking Philemon to treat him differently now in a spiritual, not a physical way, spiritually as a brother, but not literally as a brother, not demanding that Philemon physically free Onesimus. Ryrie notes that in the Middle Ages, Christian slaveholding began a transition that after the plagues of the 14th century and much of Europe faded away. So Ryrie writes, there was of course still grinding poverty and exploitation, but the Protestant Reformation, which caused all of us, inherited something very unusual in human history: societies without slavery, unquote. Slavery began before the Reformation, and thus was a context of the Reformation, as Katie Cannon argued. But by the time the Reformation takes hold, Ryrie argues that slavery's presence in Europe had dissipated, at least the more ancient version of slavery. Ryrie admits, however, that a new kind of slavery was emerging, the one that we're all familiar with. It began with the Portuguese and extended to the Spanish. These countries began enslaving the populations of their overseas empires. The convenient argument was that these populations of black folk were not Christian. What they were was West African, and here we have the matter of race coming into the picture. These West Africans, they had natural resistance to tropical diseases, which made them great labor for sugar plantations, and they could be readily purchased and shipped to the New World. It was the African connection that made this a new kind of slavery. Atlantic slavery was chattel slavery. Humans were treated not only as property, but as subhuman, as animals. According to Ryrie, quote, what made Atlantic slavery unique was its vast industrial scale, its racial determinism, and its absolute nature, in which slaves' legal status was hardly distinct from that of animals, unquote. Racism plays a huge part in this new slave equation. The effects of this racism, the reality of this racism, continues to haunt us today. Early on, Protestant theological opinion was generally against slavery. Now, this is an important point. Ryrie makes the case that early on, Protestant theological opinion was generally against slavery. It's a mixed bag. Christianity was there with slavery through people like Henry the Navigator. It's the context in which the Reformation unfolds, and yet we've got early Christians who are also fighting against it. Quoting Ryrie here, the most widely used Calvinist catechism condemned enslavement as man-stealing, quote unquote. In other words, the great founder of the Presbyterian tradition, John Calvin, saw slavery as man-stealing, as a negative, as a crime. In 1618, the Synod of Dort not only made decrees on predestination, it considered slavery. Two key theological principles the Presbyterians were trying to work out. What does it mean to be predestined? And what does it mean to be enslaved? Trying to work both of those things out as key parts of theological understanding for Reformed peoples. The Synod stopped short of ruling that enslaved persons should be freed for fear that this would deter Christian masters from baptizing their slaves. But it did insist that once baptized, slaves could not be sold and they ought to enjoy their liberty. So it's a mixed bag, right? Of course, Protestant American slaveholders would go to great lengths later on to argue that baptism was spiritual in nature only. It had nothing to do with the slave's social and physical condition as a slave. Still, American slaveholders resisted evangelizing their slaves for a very long time over the very fear that baptism meant physical freedom. Protestant missionaries ultimately convinced many slave owners that converting their slaves was in the slave owner's best interest. Why? Because, quote, Christian slaves would be loyal, honest, and hardworking, unquote. You might not be able to continue to trust non-Christian slaves, but Christian slaves would be loyal, honest, and hardworking. Thus it came to be that, quote, Ryrie again, the more passionately Protestants believed in slave spiritual equality, the more earnestly they affirmed the legitimacy of slavery, unquote. The more they argued for the slaves being spiritually equal, but not physically equal through baptism, the more they could argue for slavery. Because it's okay to enslave someone and baptize them spiritually, since that spiritual baptism had no meaning for their physical standing. On the early period of the slave trade, Ryrie makes this very provocative statement, quote, the Protestant powers did not deliberately set out to join the Atlantic slave economy. They drifted into it like a ship moving with the current, unquote. The Dutch initially wanted to hire local laborers, not slaves, when they went into a region. But the economic reality of getting free labor as opposed to paying labor was difficult to resist. The English saw this as an economic logic. English landowners first wanted to use indentured English men and women as laborers. But as Ryrie points out, yet indentured laborers were in short supply, they had tiresome legal rights, they insisted on tolerable working conditions, and they died in the tropics at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, Spanish and Portuguese slavers had temptingly cheap alternatives readily available for purchase. So you got all these problems with these quote-unquote indentured employees, and you got the Spanish and the Portuguese saying, well, we can sell you some people, you don't have to worry about all of that with. Now, where Christian sensibility came in from moving over here to over here, that becomes the issue, right? Some Protestants, it is important to note, did oppose slavery. Samuel Sewall, the only judge at the Salem witch trials to publicly repent of his actions, wrote in 1700 that all men have equal right to liberty and that man stealing was a capital crime. In England, John Wesley agreed, quote, liberty, this is Wesley, liberty is the right of every human creature as soon as he breathes the vital air, unquote. And of course, the Quakers resisted slavery very early on. And most Protestants, however, according to Ryrie, felt it was better to work to improve slavery than to rail pointlessly against it. Work to improve it, don't stop it. Slavery might even be a good thing. Ryrie notes, quote, was not rescuing Africans from the horror of their native continent and bringing them to orderly New World plantations a kind of liberation? Some slaveholders sincerely believed this, priding themselves on their paternalistic care and on the affection they believed their slaves had for them, unquote. Protestant missionaries also made the case that there was a spiritual benefit bound up with evangelizing slaves. Quote, if slaves converted, their bodies would still be enslaved, but, asked the missionaries, why should you be men's slaves and Satan's slave too, unquote. In other words, you can still be a slave to me, but you won't be a slave to Satan anymore. There was also a conflict within Protestantism that should have resulted in a more critical stance toward slavery. Most Protestants agreed that the Bible teaches that all humanity comes from a single stock in God's image. The common origin, therefore, means that all humans are related to each other. Here is where racism plays a powerful role. As Ryrie points out, Atlantic slavery and racial prejudice blended to produce a uniquely poisonous brew. Africans, it was ultimately understood, were less than human, were more akin to animals, and thus not worthy of human freedom. Ryrie points to a slave owner in Jamaica who argued with a missionary that to give communion to his slave was no more efficacious than giving communion to his horse. In Barbados, a slave owner told a missionary that he might as well baptize a puppy as to baptize a certain Negro. Now, because our time is limited this afternoon and an entire historical survey is not possible in the space of one lecture, let me point to two powerful Presbyterian voices with regard to the matter of slavery that are somewhat indicative of the Protestant perspective on the support of slavery. The first is the renowned theologian of the South. His name was Robert Louis Dabney. He was a one-time professor at Union Seminary. In 1860, Dabney was offered a professorship in theology at Princeton Seminary, and he was also called as pastor of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. He turned down both of those positions because he owned enslaved persons, and he was fearful that his enslaved persons would be freed in the North. As Bill Sweetser notes in his History of Union Seminary, many argue that Dabney's book, it was called A Defense of Virginia, may be one of the most influential books in American history. In that book, his argument was simple. Quote, since, and I'm quoting Dabney now, since the enslavement of Africans by Europeans was permitted by the curse of Noah upon Ham, slavery was justified by Scripture. It was England who had forced slavery upon Virginia. In God's providence, slavery had actually turned out to be in the best interest of the Negroes, the South, and the nation as a whole. Abolitionists whose ancestors had made money on the slave trade only became self-righteously opposed to slavery when it had ceased to be profitable. The South, therefore, was innocent in the way, only protecting itself against tyranny. In the end, however, God permitted the South to be defeated for our sins toward God, unquote. Charles Hodge was a professor at Princeton Seminary, so influential in its history that a building in his honor is named on the campus to this day. I will note that at Union we don't have a building named in honor of Robert Louis Dabney. In 1818, Presbyterians went on record at the General Assembly that slavery was a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of nature and was inconsistent with the laws of God and the gospel of Christ. 1818, the Presbyterian General Assembly. Slavery, gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of nature, inconsistent with the laws of God and the gospel of Christ. A very powerful statement in 1818 by the Presbyterian General Assembly. The General Assembly of that year called for an abolition of slavery. Unfortunately, given the fear in the Presbyterian Church that Presbyterians themselves were divided on the matter and that pressing too strongly on the matter might divide the church, that prophetic voice was muted. In other words, many Presbyterians thought the GA was too far out in front on the matter of slavery in 1818. Nevertheless, a growing divide was developing in the church over the matter that would not be settled until ultimately the church was split. Voices against the 1818 General Assembly vote for abolishing slavery were rising. At Columbia Theological Seminary, one James Henley Thornwell, a professor there, argued that the Bible not only permitted slavery, but taught that it ought to be perpetuated as foremost among the means that God had established to regulate relations between white and blacks. Another professor. Hodge entered this discussion with a mediating position between keeping slavery as it existed and abolishing it. Hodge argued that abolitionists were wrong because they demanded an immediate end to slavery, which would cause societal chaos, and that they falsely assumed that slavery was man-stealing and murder, and that whenever it was practiced, slaves were abused. He therefore cited New Testament writers who condemned the injustices associated with various Roman institutions, but not the institutions themselves. Thus, Hodge wanted to work on cleaning up the abuses of slavery, not the institution of slavery itself. Thus, even though he considered slavery a lower form of civilization, he saw it as morally permissible. One other point should be noted. Many prominent Protestant theologians like Dabney and Thornwell believed in a doctrine that came to be known as the spirituality of the church. Any of you heard of that? I know some of you have. The spirituality of the church was a key doctrine in the early Presbyterian church in the early 20th century. A key doctrine. According to this principle, the church should have nothing to say on critical social issues like slavery precisely because it was a social and political issue. Churches were to teach divine truth and leave social and political activities to the secular authorities. Thus, many notable Protestants argue the church could and should say nothing on the matter of slavery. Another notable name in the history of Union Seminary, John Holt Rice, writes in the early 1800s, now I'm going to quote him, and listen to this. This is someone who has a great deal of authority in the early church in the 1800s. The reason why I am so strenuously opposed to any movement by the church or the ministers of religion on this subject, slavery, is simply this. I am convinced that anything we can do will injure religion and retard the march of public feeling in relation to slavery. Slaves by law are held as property. If the church or the minister of religion touches the subject, it is touching what are called the rights of property. The jealousy among our countrymen on this subject is such that we cannot move a step in this way without wakening up the strongest opposition and producing the most violent excitement. The whole mass of the community will be set in motion, and the great body of the church will be carried along. Under this conviction, I wish the ministers of religion to be convinced that there is nothing in the New Testament which obliges them to take hold of the subject of slavery directly. In fact, I believe that it never has fared well with either church or state when the church meddled in temporal affairs. And I should, knowing how unmanageable religious feeling is when not kept under the immediate influence of divine truth, be exceedingly afraid to see the church brought to bear directly on the subject of slavery. Where the movement might end, I could not pretend to conjecture." Unquote. In other words, the church should not talk about slavery because the church was a spiritual institution devoted exclusively, and some might say blindly, to spiritual matters. Now, while one can certainly point, as I just have, to Protestant connections to the endorsement of slavery or ambivalence about slavery, I also want us to know that there are helpful indications of the influence of Protestantism toward the abolition of slavery that go back also to the roots of the Reformation. So you don't just have the streams of the early Protestant church pushing us toward slavery and endorsing slavery. There are also roots in the early Protestant church that are pushing us away from endorsing slavery and abolishing slavery. So we got both stories to look at. Since I can't appeal to everyone, let me appeal to our own Reformed roots and the work and thought of John Calvin, for those of us who are Presbyterian. I've already mentioned John Wesley for those who are Methodist. There are also the Quakers, whom we all know very well. Let me go all the way back to John Calvin. Calvin's thought was used in support of slavery, to be sure, just like the Bible was used in support of slavery, particularly the concept of predestination. And we could spend a whole lecture just on predestination, right? Predestination, the idea that a collective of people may be predestined to salvation or hell prior to being born, and there's nothing you can do to change that reality. If you're predestined to go to hell, you're going to hell. If you're predestined to go to heaven, you're going to heaven. Many argue that entire nations or communities could be so predestined. And thus, if you or your people were a slave, you were predestined to be a slave, and nothing you could do or had done could free you from that condition. As one author notes, quote, "This kind of looping religious reasoning was very convenient to slave owners," unquote. Now, slaves were predestined to be slaves. A more nuanced approach to Calvin's thought is more helpful, I think. Former slave trading in France began in 1594 when the French ship L'Espérance participated in the slave trade, 1594. But the country did not become formally involved in the slave trade until 1620, which was more than half a century after Calvin's death. Perhaps the only personal contact John Calvin had with any form of slavery was the Middle Ages institution of serfdom in the northern regions of France. He was aware of the trade, and he laments the presence of slavery in Spain and among the Turks. Calvin does not write specifically about the European practice of slave trading during the time, but he has sermons on Deuteronomy where he does discuss slavery, and neither his sermons nor his commentaries address 16th century European slavery. But where the Bible speaks to slavery, there he addresses the topic. For Calvin, slavery is not rooted in the natural order of things, but it is a consequence of sin, the fall of humankind, and the marred image of the imago Dei, that we're all in the image of God. For Calvin, we are all of us fashioned after God's image. So, on Ephesians chapter 6, he writes, "For each human being is a reasonable creature, And this is derived from sin, as one evil triggers another until things descend into utter confusion. But if we examine the rights which masters had, we shall conclude every time that this is something, slavery and masters in slavery, this is something which is contrary to the whole order of nature. For we are all fashioned after the image of God, and it was thus altogether too exorbitant that a reasonable creature upon whom God had stamped his mark should be put to such insulting condition. But such are the fruits of the disobedience and the sin of our first father Adam. It has resulted in all things being turned upside down." Unquote. Calvin, reading the same biblical text that other early Christians were reading, but saying, this isn't the way things should be. This is being described as what has happened because of the disobedience of human beings to God. It is a result of our brokenness, not a result of what God expects. Calvin recognized biblical text speaking of a master's stewardship over a slave. He said, yes, I'm reading these texts with you. I see these texts. But for Calvin, this was an undesirable arrangement that resulted from Israel's hard-heartedness. Calvin therefore approved that Old Testament laws regulated slavery, even if he saw slavery itself as based in human sin. So yes, he could say, it's in the biblical text, but it's in there as a result of the brokenness of human beings, not because that's the way God wants it to be. Note his feeling about slavery as he discusses Deuteronomy 24:7. This is what Calvin says. The same punishment, death, is here deservedly denounced against man-stealers as murderers. In other words, you enslave someone, you are a man-stealer, and you should have the same consequence as someone who was a murderer. For so wretched was the condition of slaves that liberty was more than half of life, and hence to deprive a man of such a great blessing, liberty, was almost to destroy him. Besides, it is not man-stealing only which is here condemned, but the accompanying evils of cruelty and fraud, if he who had stolen a man had also sold him. Pretty dramatic in the 1500s. Calvin, reading the same Bible, but saying, this isn't the way things should be. Unfortunately, when discussing Paul's return of the slave Onesimus, Calvin isn't quite as clear. He does seem to allow the state of the slave and master to stand at that point. And yet, in this case, it is clear that it is not Atlantic race-based abusive slave trading that he is discussing when he writes about the letter to Philemon. Given Calvin's concerns about the abuses of slaves and his view of the fact that all humans, even Africans, are derived from God's image, it seems hardly likely that he would not have spoken critically of the abusive, chattel-based, racist Atlantic slave trade. So there's a nugget at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation of hopefulness. Professor Katie Cannon, let me go back to her, even suggests that in Calvin, there is a liberating, hopeful spark. While some point to Calvin's anthropology, in other words, his idea that all humans are from God and therefore we are equal and kin with each other, Cannon points to the sovereignty of God. If God is sovereign, then it is by God's rule that we live our lives. If God is king, God determines how we rule our lives. And one clear rule that Katie Cannon sees is the understanding that redemption is more than the removal of sin. Redemption is also a positive restoration to the state of genuine piety. Theologian Waldo Beach draws a conclusion. He writes, quote, "What distinguishes Calvin's treatment of this common theme of the Reformation is the way that he sets it in the context of the themes of human depravity, divine sovereignty, and the activity of the redeemed, or to use another formula, between the themes of divine human animosity and divine human companionship." Now, that's a whole lot of theological language, right? What he's saying is, if we rightly see the relationship of humans to other humans, even blacks to whites, we see that we live in a broken world where some humans abuse other humans with their power, even their power to enslave. And this is not what God expects or endorses. But no human is ultimately subject to any other than God, who is the divine sovereign, the divine king of us all. God only rules over us. Other humans cannot and must not rule over each other. When they do, it is not because God wills it, but because we defy God's rule for our lives. Those who seek God's redemptive love seek it not only spiritually, therefore, but aim to live it out materially and socially. The combination of these reformed principles works against any understanding that slavery is a just system or any idea that redemption is about the spirit alone and not also about the body and the social circumstances in which the physical body finds itself. These principles, according to Katie Cannon, press us to put our redemptive faith to work not only spiritually but socially as well. We are not just about the business of making right with God on the spiritual level. We are about the business of making right with God so that we can be made right with each other on the physical, social, political level. Which then brings me back to the work of Presbyterians at my own shop, Union Presbyterian Seminary. You will recall that many Protestants held to what I call the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, which argued that the church should not speak to issues of a social or a political nature. Katie Cannon has argued that Calvin's theology is in direct contradiction of such a belief, as redemptive ethics is not just about spiritual, but also about social and political reality. Scholars at Union Seminary, I am proud to say, pioneered the discrediting of the spirituality of the church, and in so doing, helped to set the church back in line with its Calvinist reform principles. In 1898, the president of Union at the time, Walter W. Moore, would preside over the removal of the seminary to Richmond, Virginia, from Hampton-Sydney, Virginia, to engage the urban complexities that Moore believed modern ministers needed to engage. It was during this era that the seeds of a new way of thinking and a new theological undergirding for that thinking took shape at Union, changed Union, and indeed helped change the world of biblical and theological thought. In his History of Union Seminary, Bill Sweetser is succinct. Professor Walter Lee Lingle remained in the church and set in motion the forces that ultimately destroyed the spirituality of the church, quote unquote. And I would argue the spirituality of the church still exists in some forms. It hadn't been destroyed, it's still there. But at least there is a discrediting of it. In 1924, Union Professor Lingle assumed the presidency of the General Assembly's training school for lay workers in Richmond. In 1929, at the request of students, he was invited to deliver key lectures at Union. His lecture title was The Bible and Social Problems. The published lectures had a huge influence on the church. Students flocked to his regular lectures. He taught the only class on social ethics at any Southern Presbyterian seminary at the time. The ministers who were in the forefront of changing attitudes in the Presbyterian church and thereby transforming the Southern Presbyterian church attributed their awakening to his lectures. According to Sweetser, his genius was that he could apply the social gospel to the church. Lingle called for ministers to study the social problems of their communities and then preach about those problems from the pulpit. He urged them not to engage in partisan politics, but to apply the social and ethical teachings of Jesus. And let me quote Lingle. I have a deep and abiding conviction that one of the greatest needs of the present time is that Christians should translate into life the social and ethical teachings of our Lord. Those teachings of our Lord are the only solvent for the world's social problems, unquote. This sounds more than a little like Katie Cannon's interpretation of John Calvin. Here came the work of change-oriented witness taking aim at a draconian aspect of the world, and this time it was racial segregation. This new justice-oriented theological perspective in the context of a seminary set in an urban world provoked a fierce change in student perspective and activity. According to Sweetser, Union's arrival in Richmond was like releasing a steam valve. The students established over 40 different missions around Richmond. They had an expansive outlook that could pit them against the values of the culture in which they lived. Less than a decade after Virginia discarded the Reconstruction Constitution in favor of the Constitution that institutionalized separate but equal Jim Crow laws, and the denomination kept African Americans at arm's length, Union students began missions to the residents of segregated neighborhoods in Richmond, Virginia. And so Sweetser argues we have the dawn of biblical theology, a theology pressed at Union Seminary to suggest that the church and those who preached and declared from the biblical materials to the church should be preaching the social and ethical teachings of Jesus. And that those social and ethical teachings should be taught for physical change, not just spiritual change. In fact, Sweetser argues that the issue that became the catalyst for biblical theology's deepest influence was race. In the March 21st, 1949 issue of the Presbyterian Outlook, Professor E.T. Thompson, who was brought up on charges of heresy because of his writings about race, wrote a Bible study arguing that racism was unbiblical. In fact, according to Sweetser, quote, "The attitude that the church should stand silently aloof from the ethical conflicts of modern life was incomprehensible to somebody like E.T. Thompson. E.T. Thompson taught church history for over 40 years. He didn't produce a historical work. He was not interested in studying the past for its own sake, but in using history to encourage involvement in current issues and persuade people not to repeat mistakes of the past." One scholar has observed that as one can draw a line from Walter Lingle to E.T. Thompson, it is apparent why Union students and professors became so involved in civil rights. Union Seminary had a tradition which enabled its graduates to respond to the times. "We drank from cisterns we did not hew." Or one graduate of the seminary said, "Professor John Leith grounded us in Reformed theology, not as an academic discipline alone, but as fuel for illumining the public life of the troubled and the hopeful days through which we were living." Unquote. It is fascinating to me that the Southern Presbyterian Church, which spawned the likes of Robert Louis Dabney and the spirituality of the church doctrine, and whose adherents split the church over the matter of biblical and theological interpretation and support for slavery, by God's grace also birthed the movement biblical theology that discredited the spirituality of the church doctrine and created this biblical theology that not only recognized the need for spiritual folk to speak to social and political circumstances, but then to put that activism into play in the civil rights movement. If Christianity helped support the slave trade, Christian belief also helped promote the abolition of the slave trade and the equality of African and African Americans. Thank you. Now the question, of course, is how is the church responding to matters of race, racism, and the ongoing debate about white supremacy today? That could be its own lecture and own discussion, to be sure. I want to make the argument that the seeds are there for the church to move in either direction, as has always been the case. The lecture I was just sharing is that we have these two trends from the beginning of the question of slavery and the slave trade in the Christian tradition. I think we still have these two trends that are moving in some quite different directions. And one of my concerns is that we continue to harbor a gem of that spirituality of the church doctrine, which keeps many of us from speaking out in a Christian perspective against racism and against images and impacts of white supremacy in the United States. My fear is that we won't have the courage of many of the persons that were documented in text, beginning with John Calvin and moving forward, who are able, out of their conscience and out of their biblical interpretation, to move against such beliefs and understanding. So what becomes important is that we learn from our past so that we can become better agents of Christian interpretation in the present and on into the future. So I look back at this past not as a way to mourn what we Christians didn't do and what we could have done better, but to effectively recognize that we were struggling always, and that struggle now has implications for how we struggle today, how we make decisions today, and where we plant our feet today. Do we continue to separate the spiritual and the social and political? Or do we see that God's sovereignty draws both of those and our interpretations together? I hope we're moving more in a direction where we see that God's sovereignty over all means that we speak for God in all circumstances, spiritual and social. So let me open up for, I think the intent was that I would have some questions at this time so that we could have a little bit of conversation and discussion. Yes, please.
I will be on my next birthday 70 years old. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I began to identify myself as the person, an LGBT person, which is to say a homosexual man. Mm-hmm. I don't want to let the afternoon pass without it being noted that if I would live my life truly and fully to who I am as a human being, God's Holy Bible labels me and my life as an abomination. Mm-hmm. So for a good long time now, I have come to question whether one single word of the Bible is the direct and literal statement of God. I think there are good people now, and there were good people back then, and there are hurtful, hateful, bigoted monsters now, and there were hurtful, hateful, bigoted monsters back then. And one other thing that I've come to feel very strongly about the past number of years is what humankind truly needs is a new spiritual paradigm, a new way of dealing with. I mean, if you follow anthropology, it's like the most primitive of human beings. They begin to label things as sacred. That this rock is sacred, this tree is sacred, this hill over there, and as different groups of people have different definitions of them. So there's just this primal, very, very primal, and then you can proceed through, whatever gazillions of years to a higher level, but it's just this sort of primal instinct that's there in human beings, but it needs to be. I very much hope, Dr. Blount, that is your ultimate goal, a new and better spiritual paradigm for people. Mm-hmm.
That's a very good question. I was asked to repeat the question for the microphone, but I can't repeat that. It's a very powerful question. And let me say, my quick answer is I hope that that's what I'm doing. I'm teaching courses on what are called cultural hermeneutics that I hope are moving us into that direction. When I work with my students, one of the things I'm doing is trying to do exactly what you're suggesting. Let me, because it's a big question, so let me answer it piece by piece. And well, no, but it's a really good and helpful comment because one of the reasons that I point to the slaves and their interpretation of the biblical text is because the slaves were struggling with the authority of Scripture in a similar way that you're struggling with the authority of Scripture. In other words, the Scripture says this about slaves, and then people use the Scriptures against people of African descent for that particular reason. I think you're right in the conversation when you say that the Scripture says particular things about LGBTQ, what we would call today. I think the biblical materials are speaking about something different than we speak about when we speak about homosexuality today. That's a whole different matter in terms of term and definition. But I do think that the biblical texts do have a negative perspective, just as there was a negative perspective from our perspective today about people who were enslaved. So we start from there. One of the things that I've done in working with cultural hermeneutics, I have a little chapter in a book called The Last Word on Biblical Authority in a book called Struggling with Scripture that struggles with just this kind of issue, but from the perspective of the African American slaves, but with this idea in mind about LGBTQ interpretation. And that is, I use the example of the slaves who want to maintain that the biblical words, or the biblical word, capital W-R-D, is authoritative, and that the text should be read and understood with authority. However, human beings interpreting God's inspiration to them were as influenced in their early periods when they were writing these texts by their cultural context and location as they were influenced by God, and therefore were as apt to write about their own perspective as God's perspective, and to authorize their own human locations and perspectives as much as God's perspective, i.e. on slavery. So what the slaves recognized was that one is always interpreting text. Even though they were mostly consigned to be illiterate, they were mostly reading from an oral text, they were able to read with this quote-unquote spiritual imagination that their slave owners would not allow. So on the one hand, they could see the biblical text as an authoritative witness to what God was doing in the world, and yet see that there was brokenness in that text because broken humans were conveying their interpretation of what God was doing in the world, and that brokenness was inscribed in the textual material itself, and that came out in regard to slavery. So I would make the argument that that comes out in other areas as well. And I think it does come out, and Paul is talking about issues related to sexuality. So that is an interpretive, hermeneutical perspective that then moves into a cultural hermeneutical interpretive process. That's where I begin in trying to look at it. And I know it sounds complicated, and what often happens is someone says, well, you're not just reading the plain words of the text, you're making an interpretation. Well, that's right. I'm not just reading the plain words of the text, because the plain words of the text are problematic for me as a person of African descent. And they were problematic for these African Christians. What they were trying to do was to hold on to the faith while recognizing that broken humans have always been interpreters of the faith, and not to allow that human brokenness to be the faith. Amen. But what that brokenness is trying to point to. And so therefore they could challenge a text about Onesimus being sent back to Philemon. They could challenge that text, and yet on the same hand, they could go to the biblical text and look for the movement of God within them. How is that possible? Because they differentiated between what God was doing and what humans, broken humans, were doing, and interpreting what God was doing, and then writing that down into text. So it's a conversation that would obviously take me a little bit more time than one answer to one question, but that's how I begin this process, and that's why I use the slaves as an example, because for me, the slaves are a personal example, but it's also the case that it is almost impossible for Christians today, even Christians who disagree with my interpretation here, to make the argument that African American slaves were less Christian than white Christians at the time. As a matter of fact, most people ultimately looking back into history give an understanding that these African Americans were probably more quote-unquote Christian than their slave owners. And yet, they had a critical perspective on text interpretation. They were not just reading the plain words of the text, because the plain words of the text were destructive. It would also be the case for women reading the text. And women rightly point out that it should not be the case that women should be obedient to their husbands as unto Christ. It should not be the case that women should remain silent in church. But how can you be a woman and affirm the scriptures as authoritative if you disagree with those particular texts? Well, the slaves, again, they were providing an example, because these broken Christians were interpreting from their male perspective, and that perspective leaks through in the way they're trying to understand and interpret what God is saying in the text. So we look at the brokenness, but we appreciate what the brokenness is trying to point to. And what we want to do as Christians is recognize that all of us, when I get up and preach I'll be preaching tomorrow, I don't anticipate, and I hope no one in the congregation is anticipating, that I'm speaking word for word for God, because I'm speaking as a broken interpreter, trying my best to interpret what God is doing through these texts, and my brokenness sometimes comes through. And I hope it doesn't come through in a way that's harmful, but yet sometimes I know it does. And then I have to reevaluate. And one example, I'll use an example from I said I would stay over here near the microphone. One example from my own teaching, I was teaching this course on cultural hermeneutics, trying to make these very points. And we were looking at interpreters, African American interpreters, we were looking at womanist interpreters, we were looking at feminist interpreters, we were looking at Asian American interpreters, we were looking at from India. We did have the person I taught the course with, we did have Native American interpreters. We were looking at LGBTQ interpreters. We were looking at all different kinds of communities who were interpreting the text. And so I was looking at a text and I was reading from the Gospel of Mark, and I was reading a translation, and it was talking about in chapter 2, 1 through 12, the paralytic. You know that story, the paralytic who the 4 men brought to Jesus, and they, Lord, that's right, they tear a hole in the roof and they let him down, all this, and through. And then someone who was disabled in the class came up to me and said, well, you know, I wish you would read some on disabled hermeneutics and what it means when you are someone who can translate from the Greek and you're reading this English translation, and what you've done is you've identified the paralysis with the person, so you've kind of made the person a paralytic, not a person with paralysis. You made his person be the thing itself. And so I thought to myself, so the response I could be was, reject that and say, no, you're just listening to it wrong, or go and do some reading and see if I could find out. What I found out is a whole set of materials on disabled hermeneutics, and making the point that he was making to me. In many cases, disabled Christians are saying they feel like one Christian who poignantly said sometimes she feels when she rolls her wheelchair into the congregation, into the sanctuary to be with the congregation, by halfway through the sermon she feels like she should turn the wheelchair around and wheel it back out. Why? Because there is a lack of sensitivity to the fact that one should not connect the actual broken, physical brokenness with the identity of the person, or when one uncritically preaches on a healing story as if to say, well, when the healing took place, that the person now was closer to God than the person was before the healing took place, or that the healing is necessary to make the person right in the text. Why is it that the case? And if that's the case, what does that mean for me who's not healed when I come in and out of church on a Sunday morning? So for me, that made me think, well, I need to be thinking again about how I understand this text material that was written in the first century, the New Testament materials in any case written in the first century, and how authors who did not have that kind of sensitivity and understanding would not have really had place to have that be a part of how they interpreted what God was doing when they were narrating a Jesus healing story, for example. So I can then therefore understand when we get to a text where Jesus, in that very text I just cited, you remember one of the interesting things that happens when they lower the man who has a paralysis down. Jesus looks at him, and the first thing I tend to expect is Jesus is going to heal the man. The first thing Jesus says is, your sins are forgiven. And that seems to be the end for Jesus until someone says, oh, he's committed blasphemy. He's declaring that you can forgive people's sins. It's only at that point that he then does the healing. Because the physical ailment is not the thing that he is most concerned about, is the broken relationship with God that he's focused on. It's not as though the physical illness is an evil in and of itself. And what disabled hermeneutics is saying is we should stop preaching and teaching from the Bible as though that's the case. Be careful about it, in other words. That has made me careful whenever now I preach a miracle story, or when I teach and interpret, and when I look at a text, so that I now don't want to say the paralytic in chapter 2, 1 through 12 in the Gospel of Mark. I want to say that in a different way. So I'm continuously trying to learn and respond, but the slaves helped me, the enslaved persons, African-American enslaved persons in the United States, they've given me a roadmap. Because they don't throw the whole Bible out in the authority of the biblical text, but they want to read the biblical text and recognize something's going on here. These authoritative texts are going to be authoritative, but I also want to recognize that these broken humans relayed these texts to me, and I don't want their brokenness to be the thing I worship. I want the thing they're trying to convey about God to be the thing I worship.
This is a tricky. I've tried as hard as I can.
I'm going to come right to you. Okay.
I've tried to understand Q, the Q and L.
Yeah.
If I come to Richmond, can you give me an adequate understanding of queer theory?
I'll do my best. Okay. I'll try and point you to some resources of people who do it better than I do.
Okay.
Because there are people out there who do. Matter of fact, I would suggest, well, I know one named Stephen Moore. You should read some of his books. He's at Drew University in New Jersey. And there's another person who was at Yale, teaching at Yale for a long time, and his name won't come to me, but he's also someone you should read.
And then a couple of your books after.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
perhaps I missed something, but does it bother anybody that one of the most compelling stories of the Old Testament, the children of Israel in captivity in Egypt,
Right.
reflects and illustrates God, how far God's going to go to get his people physically free?
Yes.
Is there any justifications that have been given for, oh, that's different?
No, as a matter of fact, let me go back to the African-American slaves. They use the Exodus story as the prima facie evidence that God is physically involved in liberating God's people. So to go down Moses, Harriet Tubman being labeled Moses, the whole imagery, King Jesus in the New Testament connected with the Moses liberation imagery. So that is a primary emphasis within the African-American tradition that comes out of the slave tradition. It's also primary within biblical interpretation in terms of liberation. So no, we're not missing the exodus of the Israelites, the Hebrew peoples. It's one of the key illustrations and examples. Ironically, Old Testament and Hebrew scholars point to the conquest narratives. So when the Hebrew people come out of Egypt, out of enslavement, what do? One of the problematic things is that they conquer themselves and then enslave. So the people who were freed then become perpetrators of the thing they hated and moved away from. Again, the brokenness of humans becoming a part of it. One of the gifts of the biblical text is that it doesn't shy away from that truth. It shows these people in an unvarnished truth. It shows them on conquest narrative. In other words, going and taking the land from the people who were on the land and then enslaving those people to themselves. So one of the gifts, I think, of the biblical materials is that it gives us a truthful representation of God's people. It doesn't whitewash the presentation, and we can learn from that. But yes, that's a key piece, a key liberation piece. Yeah. Yes?
I just wanted to mention something because it's been on my mind for several years. About 25 years ago, I was listening to a lecture, and the theologian was talking about the same matter you just mentioned.
Okay.
And at the end of the lecture, I said to this highly respected theologian, isn't that a strange thing? These strange people who didn't know Christ, Joshua was now being told, to go and invade and burn and conquer. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing you just mentioned a while ago. Mm-hmm. And I said to the theologian, isn't that terrorism? And he couldn't respond. Mm. And he told me, that's a tough one, and I have to get back to you on that. Mm. But I thought I would bring it up because you just mentioned it.
That's right. I trapped myself, didn't I?
Well,
yeah. I would, I think I want to be careful about the term because the term we use for terrorism has a different set of implications than what was going on in the time of the Exodus event, in the Exodus narrative. What you had during that time was conquest was kind of the nature of peoples engaging other peoples. So that needs to be a part of the larger context. Terrorism today is not the nature of the way people typically engage other people. It has become kind of an aberrant way in which people who have less power try to violently gain power over or insinuate their power into a conversation or into a physical location or context. So I want to be careful about the terms, but I do want to agree that the sense of conquest narrative is problematic, and it's problematic for interpreters today. As they look back and they recognize that something that we would not consider completely positive is going on as these narratives unfold in the Old Testament materials, and that is, you do have well, that's why they're called the conquest narratives. It's a complex portrait. It's not just one people kind of going and taking, Eden or land where nobody was there. They're going and moving people off the land in order to secure the land for themselves, and then holding these people who have been defeated in a particular kind of precarious relationship to themselves. So if you are a Canaanite or a Hittite or a Jebusite, this doesn't look all that great to you, right? it doesn't seem as though this is a fair way in which history is unfolding. And that's one of the problematic ways in which scholars are trying to address the conquest narratives today, as complex. It's much more complex than at least it was when I grew up, thinking, well, that's the promised land, and the land God was to give to these people. Didn't matter really about the people who were there. These people were promised it and they were going to get it. It's more complex than that. And that has implications for how we live today, obviously, how we engage one another and how we then call upon the backing of God to do what we do in our engagement with one another. There's a lesson to be learned from that. And we often dismiss the lesson, I think. These materials are complex. But I think the gift of these materials, as I said a little earlier, is that they don't hide from the complexity. They give us an unvarnished representation of the people of God trying to be the people of God. And so slavery ekes out of that. The brokenness of the way women are treated, it ekes out of that. The way in which we understand sexuality today is different from then, it ekes out of that. And we have to recognize that we have a choice to make. Are we going to read literally and on the plain surface of the text and therefore say, well, it says this, doggone it, that's what I'm going to do no matter how it hurts? Or are we going to be sophisticated enough to say, well, God was working through broken humans and sometimes the brokenness gets inscribed in the material. And we have to be sophisticated enough to recognize when that's happening. And if an African American slave without any kind of training, illiterate, can make that move, why can't we?
So I'll see if I can pull this together because preacher's brain is running around with 10 men with skin disease. They're not lepers, they're...
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And that Katie Cannon's, that redemptive piece versus forgiveness. You know, that 9 are healed and 1 is redeemed.
Right.
1 turns... What does that look like in today's journey away from racism? The difference between whites saying, we are so sorry. What does the redemptive move look like?
Yeah, that is a very good question. What does a redemptive move look like? For me, it looks like more than saying, I'm sorry, either liturgically or politically or socially. It means being invested in restructuring and recreating the circumstances that caused the situation to develop and finding ways to address the brokenness in the past that can bring healing in the present. And as long as we keep saying, well, those things happened back there, they don't have anything to do to me, redemption can't occur. Because the brokenness that happened back there has a legitimate impact on how we're living today. And that doesn't mean, I mean, you know, there's a whole discussion about, you know, reparation and those kind of things that's now blown up into the presidential, at least the Democratic conversations. I'm not one who argues for reparation in the sense of paying African Americans, because I don't think, I mean, on both sides of my family, my great-grandparents were slaves. But to pay me does not bring the right kind of redemption or reparation. What it does do, however, I mean, the whole idea of reparation, what it does do is push us to recognize that the broad community of African Americans have been denied the same starting position, and how do we repair that? So redemption has to be a part of that repairing. And how do we structurally talk about that and do that in a fair way? That's when I think that's when we begin to heal the wound in a way that we have been unable to heal it today. Because, you know, one of the difficulties, as you know, is that whenever you try to heal a wound that is a legitimate attempt to heal a wound, it means you are going to take something from people that they have become accustomed to. And
well, that's what I heard in your lecture earlier.
Yeah.
The fear.
Yeah, the fear.
Economic fear, the
Yes.
position, the power
That's
fear.
right.
And they'll leave my pews.
That's
fear.
right. Yeah, they'll leave my
If I
pews.
preach that, they'll leave the pews.
That's right. That's a big fear. That's a huge fear, and I recognize, and I do recognize that I'm a professor at a seminary, and I come into a church congregation, I can teach a thing, and then I go on back to school, right? So I don't have that same sense of cost analysis about the leave the pew thing isn't as important for me. Of course, I do have as a seminary president I'm not going to donate to the seminary kind of concern as well. But yes, I think that the courage to be able to represent what people like Calvin and others in their tradition, in their context, were able to represent is what we're called to do. And to be a little more clear than Calvin was, for example, when he was talking about the letter to Philemon. How we're able to do that will have a huge impact on whether or not we get beyond this in a way that is not inherently destructive. Because I don't know that we've gotten, sometimes I hear people say, well, we've turned the corner. I don't know that we've turned the corner, and I still worry that something will erupt that will draw us into a morass that we're not ready for, and that a race will be part of that igniting of the thing because we haven't dealt with that issue. So I think reparation is necessary, but reparation in the sense of repairing the breach that occurred and not giving money to individual people. But we don't even have the courage to talk about that. And I think we don't, because it means that to do that, it means we have to take some over here and put it over here, and we don't like doing that. And that's why I'm afraid that, well, I'm just afraid for us. And, I'm not the only one. We had a Presbyterian Outlook celebration for the Presbyterian Outlook magazine last Saturday, and we were talking about, I was looking at some things with Thomas Jefferson and his own complicated situation, relationship with his slaves. But Jefferson was at least prescient enough to know, or to say, that I'm paraphrasing him, but I fear, when I think about the justice of God, I fear for my country. And he was talking about in terms of race. That was the implication. He himself wouldn't, he didn't free his slaves before he died, and it was just a whole complicated issue and mess that resulted. But he recognized that this is a thing that could break this country, and he was fearful that we wouldn't figure out how to do it before the breaking occurred. When I think about the justice of God, it makes me afraid for my country. I think reparation of some type, redemption of some type, is that critical. Mm-hmm.
So the question, Professor, how does culture hermeneutics deal with American greatest sin?
Yeah, how does cultural hermeneutics deal with America's greatest sin? I make the argument that we need to begin to read the biblical materials from the perspective of the disempowered in our country, and read there before we read from our own locations of privilege and economic and political success, which means I'm not talking about white people and black people, although it's a lot about white people and black people and Native American peoples and Hispanic peoples, etc. I'm talking about myself being, I have to be able to read from a position of the disempowered as well, because I come to a circumstance of privilege that I know many others don't have, racially, economically, politically, socially as well. So I recognize that I'm part of the problem when I'm talking about the problem. I'm not part of the problem in terms of racism, I don't think, although I think I agree with the social critics who say we all have a problem with racism, no matter who we are. We just haven't recognized the extent of it. We're all in a continuum. But I do think in terms of the disempowerment, I think that's a place where I need to spend much more time reading the biblical materials and thinking theologically from the perspective of the disempowered in my country and world, and I don't do that often enough. So that's where I would begin, by challenging us to read these texts not from our place in life, but from the place in life of the people who are less empowered in our communities, and then read these materials. Read that story about the lepers read the other biblical stories. Try to figure out how to read it from that perspective rather than the perspective we normally bring. And I think that will draw us into a deeper, richer conversation about the interpretation of these biblical texts, whether it be about gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, whatever the case. Read it from the underside. That's, I think, what we're being called to do. And and you think, when you think of these biblical texts, they're all about people from the underside. From the Exodus accounts to the earliest believers in Christ. These are people from the underside for the most part. God is doing something in their midst, and I think if we can be able to see, we'll see God doing something from that perspective today. That'll change how we read these texts. It'll give us much more empathy, too, in how we read these texts. And that's one of my concerns about the contemporary evangelical movement, which I have many affinities for, but one of my major concerns is that there is a lack of ability to read from the perspective of the dispossessed. And that's why I think there's a tendency to lead so much heavily on the spirituality as opposed to these other kinds of emphases. Because you can afford to read the text spiritually if your physical location is one of empowerment.
I'm trying to turn my phone back on because I can't remember this author. Our preacher, Bill Neely at United, challenged us at the beginning of Lent to read the book Waking Up White.
Yes, I've heard about that book, and I've read some pieces of it. I've not read the whole thing. But it's
for me, that is a little step to get to the disempowered, because I have to be aware of who I am in the process.
Right.
And boy, that is a rude awakening, the different things that she discusses.
Right. Until you can admit the power you hold, it's hard to identify with people who hold no power. Yeah. That is, I've heard many testimonies about that book. That it's been a wonderful awakening. My wife has read it in a book club where there was, I think there were two African American women in her club, and the rest were white, and it was a really interesting conversation for her to hear.
I think that kind of discourse is really how we can get to understanding the disempowered.
I agree.
Any other suggestions?
Well, I think reading is one, and I think becoming actually involved in participating in small ways or large ways in activities that are helpful for people who are disempowered, whether it be involved in something as traditional as working in terms of food or clothing, or whether it becomes involved in a political engagement with political representatives about writing or showing up, trying to encourage others within a church community, for example, to have a representative voice when there are key and critical issues that are taking place. I think we can become more involved if we press ourselves to think more creatively about how we can be witnesses, quote unquote, to what God is doing in the world in light of the dispossessed and the disempowered. Maybe I should come to a conclusion by talking about the book of Revelation, which is not what I'm talking about today, but as many of you know, it's one of the things I've been working a great deal on. John's primary demand of his people was that they stand up and witness to what God was doing in the world in a transformative way that would change the power structure in the world from Rome being in power to God's position and God's perspective being empowered. But you couldn't do that unless you were willing to take the risk of standing up, speaking out, even when there was going to be a significant cost involved. That doesn't mean that you only speak out in time when there's a big cost involved. There could be no cost or little cost or perhaps some big cost. But the key for John was stand up and witness when that witness is called for. Let me say it's been a pleasure to be with you for this afternoon. I have been very much engaged in looking at these kinds of issues and writings of late, and I'm glad that you're engaged in this kind of conversation, and I was deeply pleased that you would invite me here to come and talk about this, because I know it's a sensitive matter as we talk about it. But I'm glad that you're on this road, and I hope that you'll continue to study and find materials and resources to think about this. But I do think for us as Christians, it begins with the question of how we interpret. What kind of hermeneutics do we have? That will become key for how we then move forward as Christians living our Christianity out in the world. If it is a plain reading of just what's on the line in the text, we're going to be one kind of Christian. But if it's a way of reading and understanding how God is operating in the world, and God can and does operate through broken Christians, even the ones who are right in these texts, it's a different kind of understanding of how God is operating in the world. And that's why I like these slaves, because their interpretation was on this other spectrum, other end of the spectrum. They can teach us a great deal.
So what is the one best of your books for me to read? What's the one best of your books?
Oh, that's a very good question. Ha ha.
That's probably all I can handle is one.
Is it one? Probably all I can handle is one. For me, it would be a toss-up between can I get a witness reading the book of Revelation through an African-American lens, or then the whisper put on flesh, New Testament ethics through an African-American perspective. I think maybe then the whisper put on flesh, because it looks at Paul, it looks at Mark, it looks at John, it looks at Revelation, but it looks at it through this lens I've just been talking about. So maybe the whisper put on flesh. Because what happens is it's looking at because that's looking at New Testament ethics, reading the Bible and how it has implications for how we ethically govern and structure our lives today. And it uses the lens of this study of the slaves to help us make that determination as we read biblical text. So we're reading Mark in a different way. We're reading Paul in a different way. I can't remember the title of the chapter on Paul, but it was something like preaching liberation, ... sometimes. Because Paul is liberative, but sometimes. He's limiting other times. But looking at a whole, in the Gospel of John, and then looking at the book of Revelation. So there are 4 or 5 key texts, and looking at how we ethically grow as Christians out of those texts, but reading in a new way. Thank you all very much.